Warren Harrington had grown disenchanted with the holiday season. Despite his wealth and success, happiness seemed elusive. He yearned for the days of childhood when he believed in the magic of Christmas. But those days felt like distant memories. Seeking solace and solitude, he purchased a new property far from the city and its people, far from the hate and wickedness that had taken root in his life. The new place was nestled in a remote, serene location in the foothills of Little Bear Mountain. Warren hoped the isolation would help him reconnect with something he had lost over the years. As December arrived, he decided to explore his new land, wrapping himself in a heavy coat to brave the chill. While wandering through the forested expanse of his property, Warren stumbled upon something unusual: an ornate antique metal gate, intricately designed with images of snowflakes. To either side of it there were only trees, and Warren could tell there was nothing notable beyond the gate. Its presence, however, struck him as odd given the remote location, and curiosity got the better of him. He approached the gate, and with a firm push, it reluctantly swung open. To his amazement, when he passed through, Warren found himself standing in the midst of a winter wonderland. An enormous building loomed before him, 3 stories tall and as wide as he could see. The architecture was uncommon for these parts. Turkish, perhaps. The walls were decorated with wreaths and candy canes, and every surface was lined with Christmas lights. But there was nothing cheerful about this place. The structure and the decorations appeared run down and dilapidated. Sections of the roof were even beginning to sink and sag. There was no sign of activity anywhere, and the only sound was that of snow settling all around him. Warren was sure he had lost it, that the stress had finally broken him. Confusion and dread overtook him. Nothing about this felt right, and he suddenly needed to get out. He turned around to leave through the gate, but it had silently and inexplicably locked behind him. Panic gnawed at him. There was no way this could be real, and yet he couldn't deny what he was seeing and feeling. Hesitantly, Warren ventured closer to the silent building. As he drew near, he had the thought that he was walking further into his own fractured mind, further into insanity. It was the only thing that made sense. Intrigued and fearful, Warren entered through the building's front door, cautiously exploring the decaying space. He was met with the sight of dead, dusty machines and conveyor belts lined with old toys. A dozen artificial Christmas trees stood within his sight across the shop floor, but each was leaning and had lost most of its ornaments. Warren walked into the center of the shop floor and stopped. He slowly turned in place, taking everything in. He was cognizant enough to know where he was, and also to know that he couldn't possibly be here. Yet his senses were telling him that he was currently standing in the workshop of the fictional character of Santa Claus, only it seemed that something sinister had happened here long ago. Instead of magic and Christmas cheer, Warren felt only a pervasive darkness. At that moment, an icy wind blew in from the back of the shop. Against his better judgment, Warren began walking again, moving toward its source. He found a large door standing open, its hinges visibly damaged. The door led back outside into a large courtyard. A dead Christmas tree, at least 50 feet tall, stood at its center. On the other side of the courtyard was a mansion, similar in architecture to that of the workshop. It looked like a haunted house out of some old horror movie. The mansion was gigantic, probably built large enough for the Clauses and all of their elves. Warren shook his head and rubbed his eyes. He couldn't believe he was entertaining ideas of Santa and elves and flying reindeer. He was no fool. He knew these things didn't exist. But for whatever reason, his mind had decided to put him here anyway. He started walking again in the direction of the mansion. Almost immediately, something crunched beneath his boot, and he nearly twisted his ankle. When he regained his balance, he looked down to see what it was. A small, frozen hand was sticking out of the snow. Fear washed over him. He wasn't sure at first if it was a person or a fallen statue of some kind, but upon closer inspection, he knew. Brushing away the heavy snow, he uncovered the body of what could only be an elf, dressed in the green and red holiday-themed attire one might imagine. The little guy even had pointed ears, although one of them had broken off. Warren slowly stood, shaken at the sight. and was suddenly hit with a shocking realization. The entire courtyard was covered in similar small mounds of snow, bits of green and red clothing showing through in places. If his mind had truly created these visuals, it had created a massacre. He crept toward the mansion, carefully avoiding each body he came across until he reached the front steps. As he ascended, the door before him creaked open on its own. Maybe it really was a haunted house. He pulled out his pocket knife and unfolded it with a click, assuming it would probably do him no good. The inside of the mansion appeared exactly as expected. Once beautiful and festive, now the decor was only indicative of mayhem and chaos. A large staircase in the center of the parlor led up to the second floor, which appeared much darker. Warren was unsure if he should go on, and as he contemplated trying to turn back, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around just in time to see the deadbolt locking on its own. He grabbed at it, trying to unlock it with all of his strength, but it wouldn't budge. That's when the first footstep echoed from somewhere behind him. He froze in place, still facing the door. There was another footstep, then a third. He realized it was someone walking down the stairs toward him. From the sound of it, they were gigantic. Warren slowly turned to face the oncoming presence. The figure stood at least 8 feet tall, dressed in a red suit trimmed with fur. Its long white hair and beard were matted and filthy. Its face was twisted and menacing with eyes as black as night. In one hand, it held a massive sword, the blade covered in dried blood. Without taking his eyes off of the figure, Warren continued struggling with the door lock. The monstrosity stopped 3 steps from the floor and lifted its dead eyes toward Warren.
"Oh, you mustn't leave,"
it said in a gruff, disgusting voice.
"You haven't gotten your present."
Warren wanted to scream as the figure began walking again, but he couldn't make a sound. He pulled and pounded at the door, desperate for escape. The sinister figure reached the floor and took 2 more steps before raising its sword, preparing to strike. Warren released the door and steadied himself, anticipating its attack. With a loud grunt, the monster swung the sword downward. Warren hit the floor just in time, the blade smashing into the door, splitting it in half down the middle. In that second, Warren wondered if he'd be able to use that to his advantage. But before he knew it, the figure had wrenched the sword free and taken a large stride toward him. He scrambled to his feet and managed to take only a single step before the monster's free hand grabbed him by the front of his coat. Warren panicked, screaming and stabbing at the beast's hand with his pocket knife. It roared at him ferociously and lifted him up, his feet dangling above the floor. He saw the sword rising again. There was nothing more he could do. Warren's entire life flashed before his eyes in that moment, and for the first time in his adult life, he could clearly see himself as a child again. The memories of all those Christmases with his parents and sisters flooding back. He remembered being happy. He remembered the magic of Christmas. The monster roared again, but this time it sounded as if it had been hurt. It released its hold on Warren, and he dropped to the floor. The thing staggered backward, shaking its head. It looked straight up and opened its mouth wide, thick black smoke beginning to billow out. The smoke accumulated and swirled above it. Warren knew he should run, but he was transfixed. As the darkness within was being dispelled, the figure was shrinking down to a normal size. After a few seconds, it was done, and Santa Claus himself stood before Warren. Santa looked feeble and confused, unsure of where he was or what had happened. His eyes lifted and locked onto Warren's as if recognizing him from long ago. He barely whispered,
"Warren?"
The heartfelt tone of Santa's voice touched Warren, fully reigniting that fire of childhood wonder in his heart. He climbed to his feet and took a step forward.
"Santa?"
he said. Santa, in a sudden transformation, stood tall and formidable. The blackened blade in his hand disintegrated, its particles joining the swirling vortex of smoke. A great, magnificent new sword materialized in Santa's hand, its blade gleaming with an otherworldly light. His fur-trimmed suit became a suit of armor, his eyes became clear, his expression one of determination. He looked like a knight of legend, worthy of the Arthurian Round Table itself. With newfound purpose, he declared,
"You go on home, Warren. I'll handle things here."
Warren smiled and nodded in gratitude, his hope renewed by Santa's transformation. As he started for the door, the smoke shot down to the floor and took a solid form more vile and monstrous than before. Cloaked in a shredded black robe, its long, pale arms held the bloody sword, and its malicious face and red, glowing eyes were the stuff of pure evil and nightmares. Before Warren could react, it swung its sword at him. With a loud clang and a shower of magical sparks, Santa's sword deflected the blow, pushing the creature back away from the door.
Run, Warren!
Cried Santa. With the energy of a child, Warren bolted through the shattered door and down into the courtyard. As he ran, he could see the once frozen elves beginning to awaken. The villainous creature teleported out into the courtyard in a puff of smoke, attempting once again to block Warren's escape. But Santa was also there in a flash, their two swords clashing furiously. This happened twice more as Warren ran through the workshop. Bursting through the front door of the workshop, he could see that the metal gate was open again, and he sprinted for it through the snow, back toward his reality, escaping the horrors that had taken over this twisted North Pole. When he reached the gate and turned to look back, he was met with a harrowing sight. Santa Claus was battling that wicked creature on the roof of the workshop, swords clashing, sparks flying. Warren ran through, crossing back into his reality, and then watched as the gate began to fade from existence. The last thing he heard was Santa's triumphant war cry before the gate disappeared completely, leaving Warren stunned and alone in the woods near his house. The sudden peaceful quiet was jarring, and Warren stood there in that spot for a good 5 minutes, processing what he had experienced. Still unsure of what was real or illusion, he stumbled forward in the direction of his house, not realizing that his shoes were leaving behind clumps of snow which melted and disappeared into the ground, leaving behind no evidence of what had just happened. It had shaken him to his core, his belief in the magic of Christmas rekindled, but at a high cost. The memory of the battle of spirits haunted him, lingering in his mind as he trekked back toward the comfort of his home. Whether real or imagined, he knew that the violence he had seen represented the struggle within him to retain that old childhood sense of wonder. The struggle within us all.